Good afternoon and welcome to this second podcast for green infrastructure and sustainable cities. This week's lecture will be talking about the antecedents of green infrastructure and other sustainable cities and sustainable places terminology. And it will really build on last week's lecture in terms of developing those principles further and actually identifying where they came from, what geographical regions might have certain affiliations with certain types of terms, and how that actually shapes the way in which we look at green infrastructure planning. So I think the first thing to think about during this lecture, and something that we'll touch on quite a lot, is does terminology actually matter? Should we actually be looking at the ways in which the use of different terms frames the way that delivery or implementation or design or the economics of GI occurs? So is it the same if we're talking about green infrastructure or greenways, ecosystem services, green space planning more generically, biophilic cities, sponge cities, or nature-based solutions? And what we'll talk about in the lecture is the fact that each of these terms has a very clear set of antecedents and precedents about what it's supposed to be. They are located within very particular geographical context, and they promote an inclusion and a dialogue between different disciplines to actually promote different ideas and different outcomes. And because of this, we see quite a lot of variation in terms of what's actually happening on the ground. So we'll talk about the fact that sponge cities only really are appearing in China because they are being promoted by the Chinese government, and because that there's quite a lot of money and emphasis placed on the delivery of these things. The same way that if we think about nature-based solutions, they are predominantly a European Union form of development, because they're being put forward by the European Commission and are being funded through the Horizon 2020 project. But then if we start to compare this to something like green space has been around for a lot longer in terms of its terminology, and it's been used more diversely than, say, green infrastructure or greenways, because it's more generic and therefore allows more people, be it planners or developers or local people or recreational or environmental specialists, to get on board and engage with that terminology. So one thing that we'll talk about this week is this intersection and this conflict between some of these terms, and whether or not it's actually leading to a more progressive development of the argument and the use of green space or GI terminology, or if it's actually trying to partition and take different stakeholders and different disciplines off in different directions. And I think what we'll see is that we can argue that in some places it's actually brought these different disciplines together, and in others it's starting to diversify and take funding and political well-being and political support away from the other things. And there are a number of papers that start to talk about these variations. Of just four here, which you can go and look at. And a lot of the things that they think about here are the way in which we can use GI as a boundary object, something where it actually allows people from different disciplines to come together towards a consensus and a dialogue at a certain boundary. But one thing that they also talk about in a number of these papers is the fact that there are these ongoing conversations, and they run in parallel in many cases, and in some cases they actually pass each other like ships in the night. And because of that, there is a lack of continuity in terms of how we present things like urban forestry, ecosystem services, green infrastructure, or nature-based solutions, and the way in which this can then influence policy practice and different typologies of GI. So if you are interested in the more overarching conversations about where and how these different terms intersect, how they might actually differ depending on the location, then this is a good starting point. And we can also view this as being a temporal issue as well, because we can think about the fact that certain green space or GI principles or terms, such as garden cities or greenways, actually have quite a long history. They came out of a certain point in a certain time in our history in the United States or in the UK, and they were reactions to things like squalor and destitution. Whereas if we move further towards where we are now, and we look at this clustering of ideas around ecosystem services, forest cities, sponge cities, nature-based solutions, low-impact development, it is more recent as we start to conceptualise and have a far greater body of research looking at what GI is supposed to do. And again, we'll talk about these variations in terms of how things like water-sensitive urban design, for instance, has come out of an Australian context and is very similar to low-impact development or even stormwater management in the United States. So there are these spatial and geographical clusters, but they are changing over time, and that's something that we reflected on last week. And the reason why this is important is because you end up with a set of ideas all working together at the same time. And again, we have to work out whether or not they are conflicting, whether they're competing, whether they are supporting each other and being complementary, and where we might go in the future. So there's a lot of nuance to this conversation, and in many cases down to a personal preference or a disciplinary preference about which one or which ones of these terms that people are using. And one of the reasons why it's so important is because when we think about how we deliver these new ideas on the ground, we end up with quite contrasting ideas of how things should look, how big things should be, what sort of ecosystem services or what sort of functions they should be delivering, who's going to pay for it. And because of this, we see variation in actual implementation, and we don't always see the best delivery on a project. So there are examples from the Middle East, from Masdar being the classic example, from Dongtan in Shanghai, from the other eco-cities where the master planning and the renderings that they've been using have been really quite exceptional, high quality and innovative. But when it comes to delivering it on the ground, it's been less so because they couldn't necessarily sell the ideas. So one of the benefits of Sponge Cities is that the Chinese government are supporting it, therefore there's money behind it, and therefore developers can afford to bring in the most high qualified technicians to then deliver better water management. But this isn't always the case across the world. And again, there is this political and social and economic arguments that means that GI and the terminology of green infrastructure is not always presented in a uniform manner, that we have to work out where consensus actually is visible and where more conflicts might arise, and how we might use these complementary terms and their principles to develop more effective sustainable cities and sustainable management across the world. So in terms of what we'll be talking about, what we're thinking about, it's the use of terminology and whether one term is better than the other, how the history of these terms and its influence on where we are now with green infrastructure can be seen to shape and direct what we're talking about, and how they might be used in the future. So we're probably not going to have the same terminology going forward in, say, 10, 15 years' time, but will we still have GI? Will we still have nature-based solutions? Or are they particular in terms of their timing, their framing, their funding, and their application? So lots to think about, but if you are interested in some of these ideas, then these papers are a good starting point as they set out some of the interesting academic arguments about trying to find discourse coalitions where things come together and actually present a collective narrative that is positive and forward thinking, and where there are still these dislocations between different ideas. Okay, I'll see you on Thursday morning, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.